This will be the final video I'm going to do on color contrast. I'm going to talk about the results, what I showed in the earlier series of videos. I'm going to also talk about color saturation, because it's not just the luminosity values that affects the color contrast. The saturation values are relevant as well. I simply didn't read them off in the previous videos because I didn't want the videos to be like 1.5 times as long as they currently are. So I want to start off with what I believe to be an accurate demonstration, an accurate representation of what we saw in the earlier videos. This is more representative of the color contrast in old games, in which you've got sharp contrasts throughout the game. Large noticeable contrasts. And with newer games, you've got contrasts that are barely perceptible, and then you might have a little spot that's got some sharp contrast with the other luminosity and saturation values. So let's take a look at this. 240 and 127, and here we've got 221, 147, and over here we've got a value of 202 and 107. And this is what I believe to be more representative of old games, where we've got a value of 221 and 147 against a value of 202 and 107. Yeah, I noticed that older games typically have sharper contrasts. The spots where there's sharper contrast are way larger. Like it's not like it is on the newer games where there'll be these extremely small dots of sharp contrast, and then most of the image will be like this, where there's, barely perceptible contrasts. In older games, the contrasts are really all over the image. Newer games typically have luminosity and saturation values in very close proximity to one another across the entire image. At the very least, on the same objects anyway, so if there are contrasts on the ground, they'll be within 20 to 30 lumens of one another, and the saturation values won't be far removed either. And then there'll be some little spots where there are some sharp contrasts between the values. But for the most part, the image is like this, where there really is no difference in saturation or luminosity values. And even between different objects, the values aren't really sharply contrasting one another, unlike in old games where there are sharp contrasts even on the same outfit. And on the ground, there'll be dozens of patches where there are sharp contrasts. I did this because I want to show the import of the saturation values. So this is the original color I started with. Saturation value 205, luminosity 125. Now let's look at the difference here. We've got a saturation value 206, luminosity 105. Contrast is very dull. It's not very noticeable between these two right here. But of course the values are only different from one another by about 20. In terms of luminosity, saturation value is the same. Let's take a look at this. Saturation 150, luminosity 125. So the saturation value has been lowered by 50, and the luminosity is the same. Contrast is pretty noticeable, actually, but it's not extremely sharp. So the values here are 150 and 125, and they're next to this value of 152 and 105. These kind of bleed together, not a very noticeable contrast. Again, the values aren't very far removed from one another between these two. Now, this is a very sharp and noticeable contrast here. 86 and 75, and 152 and 105. However, it does look somewhat flat because the luminosity values aren't very far from one another, even though the saturation values are in sharp contrast. Even though there's a great disparity between the saturation values, the luminosity values are in close proximity. So you could make this contrast right here far sharper than it actually is by lowering the luminosity value. See how much sharper that contrast is now? Of course, the color's very different from what it was, but the contrast is obviously far sharper now because the luminosity values are farther apart. Didn't even edit the saturation values. Let's take a look at these. Value of 206 and 105 against a value of 210 and 45. Pretty sharp contrast, but once again, because the saturation values are in such close proximity, the contrast is not as sharp as it could be. So let's change that. Once again, the contrast is obviously far sharper and more noticeable than it was. $179, $125 against a value of $86.25, and of course this value, which is $210 and $45. So let's edit it so that the values are further removed. So yeah, you can see the impact that just the saturation value has. Obviously, color contrast is two-part, it's saturation and luminosity value. As I said, I simply didn't list off all the luminosity values in the video series, the value extraction series, because I didn't feel like reading off two sets of numbers. Those videos are already too long as is. Let's take a look at these values over here. This is the original color, I'm pretty sure. Regardless, it doesn't really matter. I guess we'll start at the top. 0, 0, 30, 30, 65, 30, 36, 60, 120, 60, 59, 120. So yeah, you can see the impact that the saturation value has pretty plainly. In any event, I'm going to recreate what I noticed on the ground in a lot of old video games. So you'll have little dots like this, and then there'll be another spot right next to it with a totally different luminosity value in sharp contrast. And then you'll have another luminosity value next to it. And it'll be like this all over. You know, there'll be sharply contrasting luminosity values all over the ground. In new games, it's more like this, where you'll have, you know, let's say a value of 200. Then you'll have a value of 220. Then you might have a value of 190 or so, roughly. And for new games, it's like this on really everything, but it's really noticeable when you're looking at the ground in new games, or the background. All the luminosity values will clearly be in extremely close proximity to one another. Unlike in older games where you'll have dozens and dozens of luminosity values on the ground, and they'll be very far removed from one another. But yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to add. Just look at the videos for yourself, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. New games in general just lack color contrast. They definitely lack sharp color contrasts, especially on the ground and on specific models. There might be some contrasts, you know, all across the image. And maybe on specific areas there'll be some sharp contrasts where there's, you know, great disparity between luminosity values and saturation values. But in general, new games are very bland. They tend to stick to, you know, a handful of values. So for the background, they'll stick to around 200, and for the character models, they'll stick to around 150. And for the weapons, they'll stick to around 220, and so on and so on. So there won't be really any sharp contrasts anywhere. All the disparities between the luminosity and saturation values will be around 20 or 30. Unlike in older games where you'll have disparities of, you know, 60, 70 on the same character model, you know, on even the same rock. The skies in the background, you'll have, you know, contrasts of 80 or 90. Yeah, you don't see that in games now. Yeah, my number one gripe with new games is that they don't have any sharp color contrasts. If they did, I'd be far more inclined to play new games. My number one complaint about the footage I've seen from Dragon's Dogma 2 is the lack of color contrast. I've noticed even it lacks color contrast, which isn't surprising, but it is disappointing because Dragon's Dogma had pretty sharp color contrasts in a time when color contrasts had already been lessened dramatically. Starfield is an absolutely terrible example of color contrast. I can't believe people can actually tolerate looking at that game. One of the ugliest looking games I've ever seen. But it's whatever, we'll never get decent looking games again, so I'm not even worried about it. Just keep playing old games. There's no reason to play new games that look like garbage.